Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this lecture and this evening. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to our second lecture of the lecture series of the Palestine Land Studies Center, which was launched back in November 16th by a lecture of Dr. Salman Abu Sitta, who is the donor of the archival material around which the center was established. This is all part of our soft launch for the center, and we're happy to have you join us this evening as well. It's specifically a very wonderful occasion to have Dr. Saree Makdisi with us tonight, a personal friend and a friend of the AUB community, where he has been a visiting professor and has collaborated with many of the faculty members here at AUB. I will still introduce him briefly and then give him the floor. Dr. Saree Makdisi, as most of you know, is a professor of English and Comparative Literature at UCLA. His research is focused on 18th and 19th century British literature, but it actually crosses many other fields, including imperial culture, colonial and post-colonial theory and criticism, and the culture of urban modernity. He also writes on contemporary Arab politics and culture and has written extensively on the afterlives of the colonialism in the contemporary Arab world, and has covered the Palestinian issue quite a bit. He's the author of multiple books, including Romantic Imperialism, William Blake and the Impossible History of the 1790s, Palestine Inside Out and Everyday Occupation, and Making England Western. This evening, he is going to introduce his new book, and I hope you all enjoy the lecture and take this opportunity to welcome him again among us and to thank him for giving us this lecture entitled Tolerance is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Psychogeography of Denial. With that, I welcome Dr. Makdisi to the PLSC and AUB and give him the floor. Saree?
Thank you, Huwaida. I'd like to thank, of course, Huwaida and the Palestine Land Studies Center at AUB. And of course, Salman Abu Sitta, whose work has been a major inspiration, and everybody else responsible for letting this happen, including my brother Kareem, who helped coordinate this event. Let me say, I'm sitting here in LA, I don't know, 10,000 miles or whatever it is from all of you, or many of you in Beirut. And it's sort of simultaneously very gratifying and very sad to see your faces on these tiny little screens. And so I know you're there, but you're not really there, and I'm not really there either. But I guess all I can say is let's make the most of this technology that's allowing us to communicate even by remote control. So as Huwaida said, this talk, and I want to emphasize, I'll be speaking very informally today. This talk comes out of the book that I'm just wrapping up now. And so I'll just basically give an overview of the main arguments of the book, and then some examples from what the issues that the book works through. And then of course I'll be happy to have a discussion afterwards. So the book originated actually kind of out of a Los Angeles sort of event many years ago. It would have been, I guess, 10 or 11 years ago now. So there's an institution here in Los Angeles. It's close to where I live. It's a few blocks away on Pico Boulevard, maybe a 5-minute drive from where I live. There's an institution called the Museum of Tolerance, which, despite its sort of lofty sounding name, is actually a museum, basically a museum that's very strongly developed in order to propagate the Zionist cause and the principles of the Zionist cause. But the way the museum works functionally and the way it sort of disseminates its brand of Zionism is by disseminating the message that Zionism, first of all, is a response to intolerance and violence and the Holocaust above all. And secondly, kind of the inverse of that, which is that Zionism is a form of expression of tolerance, right? So Zionism equals tolerance, anti-Zionism therefore equals intolerance. So this museum is down the road, and California school children are bused there to see the exhibitions. They have exhibitions, obviously the Holocaust features very prominently. They have exhibitions regularly on other sorts of, terrible tragedies in the world, that, Darfur and various other places and so on. Of course, the one tragedy that they never, the one human rights catastrophe that they never, of course, cover is the question of Palestine, and for obvious reasons. So anyway, a few years ago, 10, 12 years ago, when the story begins, I read a story, I don't know where it was, in some newspaper, about this museum opening. They wanted to open a branch in Jerusalem, like a sister, not a sister because it's them, it's the same people, but a branch, let's call it a branch in Jerusalem. So the Museum of Tolerance Jerusalem, that's what it was called. They hired the famous LA-based architect Frank Gehry to design the building, and it was going to be one of, if you know Gary's architecture, it's all sort of shiny aluminum cladding and very sort of futuristic looking and so forth. And they were proceeding, they raised money. They have, since it's an LA-based museum, they had very extensive connections in the world of Hollywood, and they raised a lot of money, and they launched this project. And then, into the project, it didn't take very long for this to come out. It turns out that the space that the Museum of Tolerance wanted to build its Jerusalem branch was on the site of a cemetery, Mamilla Cemetery in Jerusalem. And of course, obviously Palestinians and Muslim authorities have been pointing this out for a long time, since it's not a secret where the cemetery is. It's the most important Muslim cemetery in Jerusalem. It goes back at least to the time of the Crusades, if not earlier. And so there was this uproar about the idea of a museum. I mean, it's hard not to laugh, but the idea of a museum of tolerance being built on the ruins of a cemetery, not just the ruins of a cemetery. There's still, it's the part of the museum, the part of the cemetery where they're constructing this edifice. They started to remove the graves. So it's like there aren't graves there anymore. They were excavating. They were exhuming bodies and dumping them in cardboard boxes, literally in the dark of night, to make room for this edifice to tolerance. And of course, when it blew out into the open, there was a huge scandal around it. And people were saying, how can you build it? What does it mean to build a museum of tolerance on a graveyard, somebody else's graveyard? You're removing bodies in the middle of the night in the name of tolerance. What is this about? And there was a number of scandals back and forth, and I wrote a piece about it in the LA Times and in the Journal of Critical Inquiry. And it's a long story, which we can get into later. But the long and the short of it is that in the end, Frank Gehry pulled out of the project, and they hired another architect, Israeli-based, and he pulled out, and they hired a third architect. And so it's being constructed. I mean, the building is going up. It's there. It hasn't yet opened, and they keep running into funding difficulties. But to me, this idea of building a museum of tolerance on an ethnically cleansed graveyard, it kind of blew my mind. What does it mean, in all seriousness, no jokes aside, how can you build a museum of tolerance on a desecrated graveyard? What does that mean? What is involved in that gesture? And so asking that question was the origin of this book. And so I wrote about it, as I said, and I've written about it in other venues like Critical Inquiry and other places. So I'll try to kind of work through the arguments that I developed to explain this phenomenon to myself, what seems like a contradiction or a paradox or some kind of hypocrisy. And what I want to suggest is that actually this project is not just one of hypocrisy or it's not an oxymoron. There's something more complicated. It involves something more complicated than that. But in order to really understand what's at stake in this museum project, we have to remember that there are many forms of Zionism, but I like to distinguish two kind of main branches of Zionism. And this is not like a political science sort of classification of Zionism. It's my own classification. I refer to these two forms of Zionism as hardcore Zionism and softcore Zionism. So hardcore Zionism is the kind that existed in the 1930s and 40s. It still exists to this day. It's the kind of Zionism that says, you know, here we Zionists, we want to create a Jewish state in Palestine, going back to the 1930s and 40s. The problem is there are all these non-Jews in our way, and so we have to deal with them. We have to, you know, we have to transfer them, as they said in the 1930s and 40s. And so there's a line of Zionist thought that says very explicitly, in order to sustain this project of building a Jewish state in a non-Jewish land or in a multicultural land, we have to rid the land of its non-Jewish inhabitants, the Palestinians, or as many of them as possible. And so, you know, Ben Gurion talks about this openly. Jabotinsky talks about this openly back in the 30s and 40s. The Israeli historian Benny Morris, who's written extensively about the Nakba in 1948 and the events afterwards, said in a very famous interview in 2004 about this question of the Nakba and what happened in 1948. He said, look, it's very clear. This is what had to be done. And, you know, to paraphrase him, actually, this is a direct quotation. There are certain circumstances in which ethnic cleansing is justified. And this is one of those circumstances. The Israeli demographer Arnon Sofer says, again, very, very bluntly, he's still working now in what he calls the demographic threat, meaning too many Palestinians, not enough Jews. That's his way of looking at this thing. He says very clearly, it's going to take violence, not just to create, you know, the Zionist state, but to maintain the Zionist state as a Jewish state, you know, with all this, with a considerable non-Jewish population as well. And so he says very, very bluntly, and again, I'm quoting him here, in order for us to secure this state, and I quote, we are going to have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. I can go on. You see what I'm saying? There's a kind of Zionism that says we have to resort to violence, and the violence is justified in search of our project. But that's what I call hardcore Zionism. So, but there's another kind of Zionism, which is actually, I think, the more mainstream form of Zionism, particularly in Europe and the US, which is what I call softcore Zionism, whose adherents would have a very, very difficult time saying we have to kill and kill and kill, or we believe in ethnic cleansing, or yes, we should depopulate the land, or we should bulldoze people's houses. It's very, very hard for people who consider themselves to be good Western, you know, liberal subjects to say that they endorse ethnic cleansing and apartheid and this kind of thing. It's really, really hard to do that, which gives rise to this form of Zionism where you have people who support the Zionist cause very ardently, very passionately support the Zionist cause, which means, of course, that they support all those things that Zionism has historically entailed, ethnic cleansing and apartheid and all the rest of it. But they consider themselves, in a very serious way, they consider themselves to be good, liberal Western subjects. You know, they believe in tolerance, they believe in equality, they believe in civility, they believe in heterogeneity, they believe in, you know, vegetarianism, all these wonderful things, the good, being kind to the environment, etc. And yet they support this state and this project. And so you might look at this and think, this doesn't make sense. How can you be for equal rights and civil rights and separation of church and state in the West on the one hand? On the other hand, you support this kind of regime. There's a kind of contradiction there. And the temptation would be to say these people are just being hypocritical. And I want to be very clear, I don't think this is a hypocrisy on their part. There's something much, much more complicated, much more, a much deeper kind of syndrome in play than mere hypocrisy. Hypocrisy, if you think about hypocrisy, somebody who maintains two opposite positions, hypocrisy involves, if you want, a kind of a sort of self-awareness. And if you call out a hypocrite, the hypocrite might blush. She might go, oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, I don't know how I can reconcile these things. So it's not just hypocrisy, because if you tell, for example, a liberal Zionist in the West, how can you support these two things? They will deny that they will deny that they're supporting ethnic cleansing, and they will deny that they're supporting apartheid and home demolition and expulsion and all the things that are happening in Gaza and so on and so forth. And so what does it take to, that's what this book is about. What does it take to, with a straight face, say you support tolerance and civil rights and diversity on the one hand, and on the other hand, you support Zionism? What does it take to reconcile that, given that, as I think, it's not just hypocrisy, it's something more complicated? What's involved is what I call denial. And it's the mechanisms of denial are they work in all kinds of sort of amazing ways. So and I want to specify two different kinds of denial. There's the kind of ordinary sort of denial, which is very important, which is the kind of denial of saying, you know, no, it didn't happen, or no, there was no ethnic cleansing, or no, the Nakba never happened, or no, there were no Palestinians, or no, they weren't forced to leave their homes, they walked away, or, you know, think that sort of narrative. And which is, of course, those sorts of narratives are aided and abetted by the extraordinarily bad journalism in US and European journalism in their coverage of the question of Palestine, historically and up to the present day, although it's getting a little bit better in some respects. So that's one kind of denial, and that plays a role. But the other kind of denial, which is the one that I'm really interested in, is more complicated, and it's one that it is able to look at the massive archive of evidence as to what has happened and what is continuing to happen in Palestine, and yet kind of not recognize it for what it is. And what I want to argue is that it takes more than just the kind of first order of denial to sustain this. In other words, saying that something isn't true, or no, it didn't happen, or no, it's not true, or it's all terrorism, or that kind of thing. It's very difficult to sustain your belief, your passionate belief in a political project by just saying no. You need something to affirm in a positive sense. And so what I argue in the book is that there's a very specific form of denial in play in Palestine, in which the Palestinian presence in and the Palestinian claim to the land is not just simply denied or refused or covered up in various kinds of ways, but it's covered up in such a way that the denial is itself denied. And that sounds abstract, but I'll explain what I mean in a minute. So, and let me give a kind of somewhat more concrete example, and I'll give even more precise examples in a few minutes. So if one of the premises of my argument is that it's very, very difficult for somebody who considers himself or herself to be a liberal Western subject to explicitly support ethnic cleansing and home demolition, which I think it is. And so such a subject would not knowingly invest emotionally and politically and otherwise in a state that flaunts its demolition of people's houses and its ethnic cleansing and that kind of thing. But people like this would happily be able to support a state that plants trees and makes the desert, or says it makes the desert bloom, and greens an apparently barren landscape, and invents clever new forms of irrigation and that kind of thing. You see what I'm saying? So it's difficult for me as a Western subject to support home demolition, but it's easy for me as a Western subject to support planting trees. Okay, what if the demolition of people's houses can be literally covered up by planting trees? So what if the bulldozing of houses is partly transacted through, it's certainly enabled by, the planting of trees, the planting of forests, greening the landscape, making the desert bloom? So a state that announces itself as a project of greening the landscape, making the desert bloom, and so forth, that state will attract a lot of support from liberal Western subjects, all the support that it needs, really, who would never knowingly support home demolition and bulldozing people's houses and this kind of thing. Now you can see slowly what's starting to happen. By emphasizing the positive value, planting forests, planting trees, plant a tree in Israel, make the desert bloom, etc., people can sign up for this kind of project. They can donate to it. They can say, oh, I love this project. Look, they're making the desert bloom. They're planting trees. It's wonderful. If making the desert bloom covers up literally, materially, and symbolically and figuratively, covers up the demolition of houses, well then, we've accomplished what we want to accomplish, right? There's a way, like a kind of alchemy has taken place, in which the affirmation of a positive value, in this case, greening the landscape, enables the denial of the Palestinian claim to the land, because houses are being demolished in the name of this value. But that denial becomes divisible because I'm not supporting home demolition, I'm supporting planting trees. So in my own head, I can still be a good Western liberal subject, and I could still support home demolition, except that I'm not really doing it. You see, my affirmation of one value covers up and sort of occludes, it denies, it erases my support for home demolition. It's that form of denial that I'm very interested in. Right. So how does this kind of project, how does this sort of discourse, a set of discourses, how does it work? I work through several different examples of this. And as you can tell, the tree planting is one of the most important aspects of this project. And I gave a talk at AUB about this 2 or 3 years ago. So the first chapter of the book is actually about this business of transforming the landscape of Palestine after 1948. So after the Nakba, after the ethnic cleansing of 1948, as you can imagine, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had been driven from their villages and towns, and there were literally hundreds of villages and towns left empty. Some of them had been damaged in fighting, but many of them were quite intact. They were perfectly habitable and so on. So in the aftermath of the Israeli victory in 1948, here was this landscape, desolated landscape of abandoned and ruined houses and villages and whole neighborhoods in Haifa and other places, and then whole towns in the Galilee, for example. And, it's difficult to say, well, we have this wonderful Jewish state and there's all these ruins or empty houses, all littering the landscape. So what do we do with this? Well, of course, what the Israelis started to do very methodically after 1948, although it took them years, it took them into the 1960s to finish this, they started demolishing these villages, making them go away. Sometimes they brought in bulldozers, sometimes they brought in dynamite, sometimes they brought in the army, sometimes they bombed these villages from the air just to obliterate them, basically, to wipe them out, to wipe the traces of these villages from the surface of the earth. That still would leave, of course, a landscape of ruin. And again, you're trying to wave flags and say we have this wonderful state and so on, and here's this landscape of ruin and desolation. Doesn't look very good, doesn't play very well. As soon as they started this process of demolition, they started planting trees also. And as you know, if you know anything about Israel, one of its big claim to fame is it's wonderful, it plants trees, and it's planted I don't know how many trees, and they talk about planting a tree and making the desert bloom. And this is one of their big cachets. And they have in fact planted, I don't know, dozens of forests throughout pre-67 Palestine. And these they're all over the place, and you go see them, and they're very, very thickly planted, mostly pines, especially early on. And the places where they planted forests it was directly over the towns that had been depopulated in 1948. So literally, the landscape of desolation and ruin fades into the green background. The trees cover up the ruins, literally. And so you don't see a landscape of ruin, you see I don't think it's beautiful, but some people think it's a beautiful alpine vista of wonderful forest and so forth. And the Israelis say, look, we're planting trees, we're making the desert bloom, et cetera, et cetera. And so literally the planting of trees, the planting of forests covers up the Nakba, the most important material traces of the Nakba, which is the ruins of the villages that were depopulated, forcibly, ethnically cleansed in 1948. So as though by magic, a project of ethnic cleansing and home demolition has been transformed into a project of tree planting. And again, the most important agency involved in this is the Jewish National Fund, which was active since the 1930s, and it's still active today. And if you go to the website of the Jewish National Fund, it's all about planting trees and irrigation and so forth. And you can give money to plant a tree in Israel, and you can go plant a tree in Israel. And if you send them money, they send you a little picture of your little tree that they planted in some forest somewhere. And you can go, also they have a sort of ceremonial tree planting site somewhere near Jerusalem where you can go and you can see your little sapling being planted, and you feel good and this kind of thing. It's all about planting trees. But as I said, the planting trees has this hideous, other side, which is covering over the ruined villages of 1948. So now you can start to see where the argument is going, right? So the people in the West who subscribe literally, materially, and emotionally and politically subscribe to this project they're not signing on to a project of home demolition. They're signing on to a project of tree planting. And so that's how they're able to reconcile their support for this state with everything that it does, with their own sense of good Western liberal values and so forth. That's one example. There's a few more examples. I'll just give a few examples, and then I'll draw some conclusions, and we can have hopefully a conversation around these things. The second example is and again, I'm sure you'll have heard this ad nauseum, especially if you live in the West, the avowed support by Western politicians in the UK very loudly, in the US even more loudly, other parts of Europe and so on. We all support, they say, a Jewish and democratic state. And you hear, and by the way, it's usually when American politicians, for example, are supporting Israel, they rarely say the Jewish state. It's always in that package with Jewish and democratic state. They all say it. Bush says it, Hillary Clinton says it, Obama says it, Biden says it, Kamala Harris says it, everybody says it. We support the Jewish and democratic state, the Jewish and democratic state, the Jewish and democratic state, always in that formula, Jewish and democratic state. And you have to stop and you think, well, hang on, what does this mean exactly? Jewish and democratic state. Jewish state, yeah, obviously it's a Jewish state. That's what it says it is. That's how it was founded. That's whose purposes it serves. That's fine. That's obvious. Democratic state, I mean, that's much more open to conjecture. I mean, democratic, if you're Jewish, it's a democratic state. There was a famous Palestinian politician once who said Israel is a Jewish and democratic state in the sense that if you're Palestinian, it's Jewish, and if you're Jewish, it's democratic, which I think sums it well. But anyway, this mantra about Jewish and democratic state, there's obviously something contradictory there's an oxymoron there. A state can't be simultaneously, Jewish and democratic, or Christian and democratic, or white and democratic. I mean, either a state is for a narrow sector of the population, Jews or whites or Christians or Muslims or whatever the thing is, or it's a state for everybody. It's a democratic state. But this idea of a state for the few or a state for one kind of people combined with a state for everybody, that doesn't make sense. So then the question is, well, what does this affirmation of this kind of democracy, what work does that affirmation do? Because it is absolutely everywhere. There's nowhere you can look in the US for discussions of the question of Palestine without coming into this mantra, which is repeated like a spell. It's like an incantation. You keep saying it and saying it. What it covers up is the reality on the ground, which is a state that is, if you compare how Israel functions to the instruments of international law, it's an apartheid state. I mean, we all know this. I mean, if you go through the laws and how the system works and the quasi-constitutional documents that the state has, it's an apartheid state. So what does it mean then? But again, as I said, in the West, very, very few people will explicitly support an apartheid state. Many people will support what they see to be a democratic state. There's an emphasis of a positive value that covers up the much darker reality underneath. Let me give one more example, which is, of course, the Museum of Tolerance built on this cemetery, the ruins of a Muslim cemetery in Jerusalem. This this case, as I said, this is what gave the impetus to this project to begin with. And I obviously have thought through a lot of what it means to invent a museum in the name of tolerance that is on the ruins of an ethnically cleansed graveyard. What's happening here is not just that bodies are being removed from the graveyard and that hence the space of the graveyard is being claimed, by a Zionist entity, the Museum of Tolerance in LA. It's that what's being affirmed is the value of tolerance. So in other words, it's in the name of tolerance that this museum is being created. And if you look at the exhibitions that are on, if you look at the way in which they describe what the exhibition space is in the museum, it's not, I mean, you think it's about tolerance. It's literally all about Zionism. So it's about the history of Zionism. It's about Zionist emigration to Palestine in the 1930s and so on. And it's nothing to do with tolerance at all. So basically it's a museum of Zionism that calls itself a museum of tolerance that's built on the ruins of a graveyard. So again, what I want to emphasize is that when people are drawn to, when they're attracted to this project, it's not in the name of ethnically cleansing a graveyard. That's what's at stake in this kind of project. After Frank Gehry left the project, the museum design was taken over by, as I said, this Israeli architect. And the building, the outdoor structure of the building is mostly, you know, the gift shop and the cafes and this kind of thing. But the real exhibition spaces for the museum are in what the architect calls a black box, which is underground. So that the right is doing this now, you know, it's sort of altered our memory of who supported this project in the 60s and 70s and so forth. If you think what it took for the left and liberal sectors of the West, Europe and America to support Zionism, it took the forms of denial that I'm talking about. And for example, I have friends, European friends, and even American friends who, when they were young, you know, and these are people on the left, mind you, who went to a kibbutz because that's what young liberals or leftists did at a certain point in Euro-American cultural history, because, as I said, this project had the support of the left. This is how you express your support. And this is what sustained the Israeli project for decades, literally. Now, this shift to the right is a very, very recent phenomenon. Of course, it reached its peak in the age of Trump. And in this, what we're seeing basically is a fading away of support for Israel among the left and among liberals in Europe and America. I mean, it's still there a little bit, but it's much more, it's really abating in a very dramatic kind of way. And it's being replaced by, if you look at the US, for example, people like Trump or Sheldon Adelson or the people on the, you know, on the right of American politics, who explicitly say we support colonization and occupation and annexation and moving the embassy to Jerusalem and all these kinds of things, which are things that the US has never explicitly done. It's always been much more kind of, you know, we urge restraint on both sides and so on. And in response, the Israelis themselves have been, in the past few years, they've been giving up all of these layers of denial that I've been talking about. And they've been saying much more frankly and boldly, no, we really are this racist enterprise that of course they always were all along, but they denied it. So for example, in 2018, they passed a law called the Jewish Nation State Law, which didn't change anything materially, right? So in other words, the Jewish Nation State Law basically gave privileges to Jewish citizens and it denied them, of course, the Palestinian citizens of the state. But of course, they had always done that. What the Jewish Nation State Law in 2018 did is it made it explicit and official and legal, whereas it had been, you know, more kind of, you know, de facto and quiet and, you know, done implicitly rather than explicitly. The Israelis, in other words, are kind of stripping themselves of all these layers of denial that I've been talking about. And they've been saying, this is who we are. And of course, in so doing, they've been aligning themselves with the likes of Trump in the US or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Modi in India and similar kinds of characters. And they've basically been banking on the idea that the project of denial that sustained them for so long is no longer necessary, that they can now come out and talk broad, you know, in bold terms, sorry, not bold terms, bald terms, in barefaced terms, about who they are and what they represent as a state project and so forth. And that's where they're going. I would like to think that that's a mistake on their part, that it's not wise for them to jettison all the layers of cover that has sustained them for literally decades on end, and for them to come out and say, no, we really are, you know, this kind of state. And if you've been following recent reports in the news, there are more and more reports are now, including reports from Israeli human rights organizations and even some journalists in the West. There was a piece in the London Review of Books recently. Israel is an apartheid state. Of course, this is not exactly news. We've been saying this for years. But now it's become news because now, you know, Jewish organizations and writers and so forth, and now they're saying it too. So it's come out into the open. In other words, this is no longer hidden. So to back up and just kind of sum up the argument, what I'm talking about here is a discourse of denial, not just a discourse, an institutionalization of forms of denial that sustained the Zionist project in Palestine for decades, and enable people to support all the things that Israel does, home demolition and ethnic cleansing and all the rest of it, apartheid, and so on, without being aware that that's what they're doing, because it's covered up by these forms of denial, and because they think they're supporting, not just they think, they are supporting tree planting and that kind of thing. And we're seeing this as that argument, like fewer and fewer people buy that anymore in the West. I mean, like if you go to college campuses now, support for Israel is dropping like a stone. I mean, they invest a huge amount of energy now to sustain the narrative of Israel as this wonderful, beneficent, tolerant, democratic, prodigy in the Middle East. And they didn't need, formerly they didn't have to invest as much in college campuses. Now they do, precisely because the story is out and nobody believes it anymore, or not nobody, fewer people believe it now than they used to. And so we're seeing, I think, kind of a massive and very important shift in the way in which Israel is represented in the West in particular. So I'll stop there. No, one more thing I want to say, which is, I think, very important, which is that when we talk about Western support for Israel and for Zionism historically, especially when we talk about it in an Arab context, we tend to think it has a lot or everything to do with masalih, with interests and statecraft and this kind of thing. And I honestly don't, I think that culture plays a much more important role than we usually think it does. Culture is what enables this support historically. It's what enables what's left of this support today. And that's really where we are. So I'll stop here and see if you have.
Thank you, Saree, so much. Edgar, if you can mute everyone, please, just Saree and me. Thank you, Edgar. Thank you, everyone. Apologies for these interventions, unwelcome interventions. I can still hear them. Edgar, can you please mute?
By the way, I want to point this out. This is what we're witnessing and hearing is, I can't tell you how important this is. We're talking about a nuclear armed state. This is what they're reduced to these days. This, right? Zoom bombing. It's extraordinary to think that a nuclear armed state literally has to send its people out to crash lectures like this with pornography and other kinds of things. To interrupt and disrupt. This is what they're reduced to. So this whole thing that Israel is this incredibly powerful force and so on, yeah, militarily, sure, maybe up to a point. I mean, yes, they can blow up the world, and that's fine and whatever. But when a state has to resort to what we are witnessing today in this very lecture, that's not the sign of strength. That is the sign of incredible weakness and desperation.
Absolutely.
And that's a very, very important point. And that's kind of proving my point for me. A state that's powerful, a state that's strong, that's confident, doesn't have to censor. It doesn't have to suppress. It doesn't have to accuse people of, it doesn't have to engage in character assassination. It doesn't have to engage in Zoom bombing. It says, well, no, we're very proud of what we do. A state that's desperate and shady and trying to cover its traces up, that's what we're witnessing. It's kind of mind-boggling if you think about it.
Thank you, Saree. Definitely can't agree more. And I look forward to reading the book, and we will continue to engage in these conversations regardless of the hacking. But I do apologize. Our IT people are on it. So let's see if we can manage fully. I would like to open the floor for questions. We still have ample time. And I would like for people who have questions to either please write them in the chat box or raise their hands, and I'll give them the floor, or Edgar will give them the floor. I want to thank Edgar. He's managing the Zoom meeting with me. So please let us know if you have any questions so we can continue the lecture through the Q&A. Okay, Michael, would you like to read the question, please, from the chat?
Sure. The first question we have from the chat is from Rami Khoury, who asks, when and where will the book come out?
The book is going to be published by the University of California Press, probably next year sometime. That depends on how quickly I finish it.
Okay. Michael Avanzato is the research coordinator at the Palestine Land Studies Center, so he's also helping. Thank you, Michael. Any other questions from the audience? If you don't know how to raise your hand, just please write the question up in the chat box and we will read it out. Saree, I have a question. If you can tell us how far along they are with the project and if there have been any holds to it or it continues to take place.
The museum project?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a building there. I mean, I've seen pictures of it. It's constructed. I mean, there's a kind of structure there. So as I said, they keep running into funding difficulty, and so it's like I think I wrote about it. I think I published that article in 2010, and it had already been several years since then. I think they started it in 2005 or something like that. So it's been 15 years, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a structure there, and originally, if you went to the Museum of Tolerance Jerusalem website, they had a very elaborate website, all the Frank Gehry's drawings and all the descriptions of all the displays and the everything they wanted to do in the museum. It was all very, very elaborate. That's now gone. At least last time I looked, it was gone.
Okay.
And so and then they keep saying they're running out of money. So I don't know exactly where they are. And they're not publishing any information about it the way they were once when Frank Gehry was on board. So yeah, there's a building there. The desecration that they've done is complete. At least that part of this. I mean, the cemetery is bigger than what they're building on, but that corner of it, they've done their work.
Okay, thanks. We have a question, one on the chat and one raised hand. So we've unmuted Sasha. I think you can go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this really great talk. I'm an art historian, and so I was really interested in this idea, both, you're talking about the tolerance aspect of the museum, but I was interested in the museum aspect of the museum. Museums both as kind of these institutions of kind of liberal ideals, theoretically, and also as kind of nationalist institutions as well. So I was just wondering if you're thinking about, or if you could speak on that.
If you go to the original descriptions, as I said, now what they're doing now, I don't know, it's gone because they're not publishing this stuff anymore. But the original descriptions, they're in my critical inquiry article, and they'll be in the chapter in the book too. There's a very vivid description of them. It's all about, as I said, it's all about, really, honestly, what it is the Museum of Zionism, right? So they're packaging a national project, but what they're doing is they're packaging it in transnational terms as tolerance. So there's a kind of a sleight of hand going on here. And of course, this is part of like the Museum of Tolerance in LA, this is part of what they do, is they push this idea of a discourse of tolerance, partly in order to say Israel and Zionism is all about tolerance. And so the exhibitions are all, like I said, if you look at their content, it's all Zionism. If you look at their framing, it's all tolerance. So there's an amazing kind of substitution. So part of it is that they're presenting themselves as tolerant and representatives and embodiments of tolerance and so on and so forth. But the flip side is also very important to them, which is that obviously, if they are tolerant and you're criticizing them, well, then obviously you're intolerant, right? So they're also pushing the contrary discourse, which is one of saying that criticism of Zionism is an embodiment of intolerance and so forth. So that's part of what's going on. And the other component to that is the recent push, which I'm sure you're aware of in the US. In the US, it happens in Europe, by the way, even more ferociously in some cases than in the US. Like the Labour Party in England imploding is partly because of this business of pushing a redefinition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Zionism to classify it as anti-Semitism. And which, of course, part of the point of that, one point of that is to suppress it altogether, just to annihilate it, right? So just as these idiot Zoom bombers are doing now, like this is it, you're seeing it. I mean, it's extraordinary that a state has to resort down to these to the gutter to resuscitate what's left of its image in the West. It's extraordinary. Sorry, that was a long and meandering response to your question.
No, it's okay. We have 3 or 4 more questions, and Michael will read them off the chat by the same order they came.
Do you think the loss of Sheldon Adelson is going to be problematic for the Israelis?
No, not particularly, because Sheldon Adelson, he wasn't. The point isn't that he was a man. The point is that he was this foundation that propagated money, right? So the money is still there. He's gone, but his money is still there. His influence will live on and have a kind of grisly afterlife. And so his project exists in a kind of institutional, financialized form. And so his influence will go on to be felt. And Trump is on the way out, mercifully. But people like Pompeo and what's her name, the one from South Carolina, Nikki Haley, they're all waiting in the wings. They're lining up again to take advantage of, to do what what their donors want them to do. If you look at we just had elections obviously in the US in November, and among the people up for election were all the people in the US House of Representatives. Among them was a candidate in New York. He was up for the seat of Eliot Engel, who has been in US Congress, a Democratic congressman. He's been there for I don't know how many years, 20 years or whatever. One of the most kind of able supporters of the Zionist project at the US congressional level. And Bowman was basically an unknown. And so this little guy, completely unheard of before in political terms, replaced the 20 banking and finance of AIPAC, et cetera. And that speaks to a kind of, partly because he's critical of Israel, but that's not the only reason. And so it speaks to this shift that's taking place on the left and what passes for the left in the US. Anti-immigrants and building walls and expelling people and locking people up and banning Muslims and all that. That's where support for Israel now is increasingly in the US. It's on the right, and it's hence more naked. Hence, it doesn't need the kinds of denial that I've been talking about. So that's why we're in the middle of this shift that's taking place right now.
Okay. Do you have time to take a couple more questions, Saree?
Okay, the next question here asks if you could put the sustained ethnic cleansing in Palestine in a historical and comparative context. Could you compare it to similar processes in the US and Canada, South Africa, to the Spanish colonization of Native American settlers? In general, are there recognizable patterns to settler colonialism, or are there particular characteristics to Zionism?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. A lot of work has been done on that very question. My friend, the late Patrick Wolf, has written an entire book called Traces of History about exactly this pattern of settler colonialism in Palestine, and he compares it to the case of the US with Native Americans and to the Australian Aborigines and so forth. And yeah, that it's clearly there are comparisons to be made, but here's the big difference. The colonization of the West of the US, or Canada for that matter, and the colonization of Australia took place primarily in the 18th century on into the 19th century. Of course, there still is incredible racism against Native populations and incredible violence deployed against Native populations in Australia, in the US, and Canada. I'm not saying that that's gone. It's still there, of course. But in terms of large scale, kind of displacing of people and home demolition and that kind of thing, it was generally a 19th century phenomenon by and large, with some notable remnants and afterlives today. The Zionist project began in the middle of the 20th century in a concerted way, in a violent way anyway. And it goes on to today. So that's the biggest difference between this settler colonial project and the settler colonial projects in Australia or the US or other kinds of places, South Africa and other places, right? This is not the 18th century. We're not the Spanish conquistadors in Mexico in whenever, right? This is 2021 or 2020 or 1950 or 60 or whatever. We are in the televisual glow of the postmodern, and this stuff is happening today. There is no other place on earth where you can take Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, the classic text of describing colonial culture, and you could open it up and literally page by page point out there are settlers there and natives there. The colonial world is a world cut in two, Fanon says. The colonial city is a city cut in two. On this side, there's this, on that. He's talking about Palestine. I mean, that at least there are no other places where you can go so bluntly and see this logic at work today. And that's what distinguishes Zionism from the Australian experience, the American experience, the Canadian experience, and so forth. That's one thing. The second thing, which is also super important, if you talk about American Indians today in the US, they are now increasingly anyway, they're referred to with, I wouldn't say reverence necessarily, but with a certain degree of respect, like, oh, these people and they're noble and this kind of thing. Or the Canadians talk about the First Nations, and the Australians are beginning to recuperate and admit, you know, what they did to the Aboriginals, not just in the 18th century, but in the 1960s and 70s and so forth. The Zionists are the only ones of all these people who adamantly refuse to recognize, to admit that they've engaged in any kind of wrongdoing. On the contrary, everything they're doing is wonderful and tolerant and peaceful and beautiful and so on and so forth. So that's also what distinguishes Zionism from these other forms of settler colonialism. So yeah, there are certain forms of comparison you can make, certain connections you can make historically, but it's egregious in its, as a contemporary manifestation of settler colonialism, for which there is no equivalent in our contemporary world.
Thank you so much, Saree. I think we will take a few more questions if you'd like to stay on. Thank you. Mike?
Okay, so the next question asks, how much does the US-led peace process contribute to this false discourse of tolerance, and what impact does it have on the Palestinian struggle?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the US peace process, as it's called, of course, we all know that's not exactly what it is. The U.S. peace, the whole two-state solution as propagated by the U.S. became an integral part of this whole story of denial. Like, what's happening? Oh, they want to make peace and they're negotiating, and one day they'll have a deal. Like that 1991 was Madrid. I've lost track. 20, 30 years ago, this thing began, and so the perpetuation of this discourse of a peace process, and look at this wonderful Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin, and how peaceful, and they're so beautiful, and they want to make peace, and they just look for a peaceful partner among the Palestinians. That whole discourse, of course, for the 20 or whatever years it was maintained, helped, of course, in the meantime, the Israelis were colonizing and building and demolishing and expropriating and all that kind of thing. So it enabled it for a long time. But who still believes in the two-state solution? Who still, and the Americans have given up any pretense. That's one thing Trump did. He said, this is ridiculous. We're going to recognize the capital. We're going to recognize the annexation of the Golan. And the annexation of Jerusalem. And there is no two-state. There is no peace process. It's all over. That's what Trump, it's really Jared Kushner more than Trump. But anyway, that's what the Trump administration, that's its position. So it's sort of stopped. Now, Biden will probably resuscitate some zombified, moribund, scarecrow form of the two-state solution, but I don't think anybody believes in it anymore. And it's become clear there will be no two-state solution. It's simply it's a geophysical impossibility. Even if it was never, I don't know whether it was possible or not at some point historically, maybe not. It's certainly no longer a possibility today. And that, of course, puts added pressure on the Israelis. For as long as they were able to go along with this discourse of a two-state solution and a peace process, and how they were just looking for a Palestinian partner in peace, and so on, as long as they were able to keep that going, you could say, well, they're democratic and so on and so forth, and all they want is peace, etc. As soon as they officially abandon that and say, no, and as many of them are doing now, we want a one-state solution, meaning we want an apartheid state, and many of them in the Israeli mainstream now are openly saying that, then it's game over, right? There isn't going to be a peace process. There isn't going to be a two-state solution. What we are confronted with is an apartheid state, an open. It's always been apartheid, but now it's going to be an openly, explicitly, de jure, self-enunciating apartheid state. And if you think an official apartheid state is going to maintain the support it's had and enjoyed for decades among the liberal elites of Western Europe and the US, you're very mistaken. That's not going to happen. So I think, I'm happy for them to make mistakes, but I think they're making a terrible mistake. And by the way, many, somewhat smarter Israeli politicians have been saying that for years. There's a passage I quote in the book by Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister. He says, he said this, I think, in 2006. He said, the Palestinian struggle is shifting, and I'm quoting him more or less verbatim. The Palestinian struggle is shifting from a struggle what does he say? In the struggle in the Algerian paradigm for, you know, an independent state, to a struggle for one man, one vote, the South African paradigm. And he says he as Olmert, a right-wing Israeli politician, he says that's a much more powerful struggle that the Palestinians have. And we'll be in deep trouble if we let that happen. That's why we need to create a Palestinian state. So we could say, look, there's a two-state solution. They have their state, and Mahmoud Abbas says yes, and all this stuff, and so on. But as I said, they've abandoned that. They've moved on to something else. And the Palestinians, I think, at this point, I mean, what Palestinians, other than, I suppose, Mahmoud Abbas sitting in his office, who else believes in a two-state solution at this point? This is something, you know, that's in the realm of fiction at this point, right? And that's where we are. So there is one state. There has only ever really been one state, and more people are aware of the nature of this state. It's, as I said, stripping itself of all the layers of mystification and denial that it used to engage in, and the world can judge for you know, people in the world can judge for themselves. I think the reason why they're so desperate, as these idiot Zoom bombers today showed us, again, a nuclear armed state reducing to the tactics of that idiot we just had on our screens. What does that tell you? This is desperation. It's panicky, sweaty desperation. That's where they are. And we should never forget that. When we think about Zionist strength, it's not strength, it's weakness. We have to understand that. And we have to understand the nature of their weakness. Few people in the West will sign on to a project of apartheid. Very few people. And the ones that do it are the ones who want to expel migrants and shoot people at the border and put children in cages and that kind of thing. Yeah, of course they exist, but I'd like to think they're a minority. And so that's where they are. And so, okay, go ahead, make my day. If that's how you want to shift the terms of the conversation, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Saree. I think we have come to the end of the hour, but I cannot tell you how much I've enjoyed this, and the reactions from the chat box are all saying it's brilliant, and I agree. And I hope that we can engage you again and again with the Palestine Land Studies Center, which is newly established, but needs the voices like yours to support it, collaborate, and I'm sure we'll reach out to you. But for now, I'm really, really grateful and thankful for joining us and offering this lecture. And I hope that the network of those who are present will continue to reach out to us as well as a center. We can build our network slowly. So thank you for all the people who joined us. And I hope to continue to send you these invitations and to have such wonderful conversations. So thank you, Saree, so much.
Anytime.
Brilliant.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.